Good evening from Pequot Library. My name is Caroline Crawford, and it's so great to see so many new and old friends here this evening. Everything at the library is going great. We've expanded our browsing hours as well as curbside pickups, and our incredible roof project is coming along by leaps and bounds. It's truly spectacular, and if you have not had a chance to come by and check it out, please do so. I encourage you to drive by and see it in person. It's really wonderful. For more information on all things Pequot, please check out our website at pequotlibrary.org. We are in for such an interesting and important conversation this evening on boys and motivation. Very timely, I think, especially in my household. Daryl Capuano of the Learning Consultants is joining us and will be speaking about a topic near and dear to his heart. I'm currently reading the book, and I love its tagline: Inspire your boy to be engaged in school, excited for college, and energized for success. Daryl's joined tonight in conversation with my friend, Steve Stanton, who happens to be a neighbor of Pequot Library and a colleague of Daryl's. We are so thrilled to have you both here tonight. It's a pleasure and an honor. We thank you for sharing your time, wisdom, and experience. And just for a little housekeeping, Daryl and Steve will be in conversation for approximately 30 minutes, and then we'll take questions, which you may write in the Q&A or the chat bar, and we'll help you with that. Over to you guys, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Caroline. So I will start quickly. My name is Stephen Stanton. I'm the director of Fairfield County for the Learning Consultants, and I met Daryl back in 2015. I had closed my investment management business around that time. I had always had an interest in education. Daryl and I were connected by a mutual friend. We talked for about an hour, and basically I was so taken by what he had to say and what was going on in his business. We joined forces at that time, and I personally have never looked back. Daryl is a graduate of Georgetown University. Correct me if I'm wrong, Daryl, but you were magna cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa. Followed that with going to Penn Law School, a distinguished career as an attorney working for the SEC, among other things, and also with the Brookings Institute, all of which preceded his work in founding the Learning Consultants in 2000, which I can now really say was his passion, and dare I say his calling. He wrote Motivate Your Son, I think because he's in a unique position of having seen lots of boys and seeing firsthand what one might call the plight of boys and all the challenges that they have that they're dealing with these days. I, being the father of 3 boys myself, found the book particularly insightful and interesting to me. So I'm happy to have Daryl here. Happy, Carolyn, and grateful for your giving us the forum to talk about this important issue. And I'm just going to start right in with a question, basically, which is, to what extent, Daryl, are boys truly struggling, and it's a very broad question, we can dial in, but what can we as parents do about it?
So the first thought is the astonishing disparity between boys and girls in achievement. And if you look at their achievement curves, and awesome, women are going up. That's terrific. And women empowerment, awesome. I have 2 girls. That's terrific. I also have a son. Fortunately, he's doing okay. But when I first started writing the book, I was watching, him and his friends, and also reading just the literature on how boys were just underachieving at an alarming rate. So let's say that the crisis is epidemic. Right before we started the webinar, I mentioned that it's not just a problem in the United States, it's nearly universal, at least in the Western world. And I'm always astonished when people contact me from England, Australia, Canada, and most any English-speaking nation when they read my book, and they'll say it's the same thing is happening here. So it is epidemic. Now, in terms of how to help them, we'll get into that. I'll let you dial into the questions, but there are ways to help them. It's a complex issue, but there's no doubt that the parents, for better or for worse, has to be probably more involved than they might want to be.
Got it. Okay. A big part of the book, and I will say your background as an attorney is apparent to me, and I know you, but throughout the book, and you bring it's a nice balance of a pretty discerning eye, as well as a love of education and the importance of education. But you talk a lot about personality types in the book, and the importance of recognizing what type of personality type we have, because what was interesting to me, and I have, again, 3 boys who could not be more different, the 3 of them. and how one responds and what one tries to do to energize them or to motivate them. Basically, it depends on what kind of character, what kind of personality they are. And so speak to that a bit, because I think that's fascinating and it makes sense.
Well, it's always interesting to me when parents have more than one child, they totally get it. They're like, ah, okay, so whatever I did with child number one won't necessarily work with child number two, even though I'm following what I thought was the good parent playbook the second time, again, assuming that maybe that things worked out for the first kid. They realize that people are different, and people innately understand this. And then they start to think, okay, so what do you mean by different personality types, and how do you discern them? You brought up the fact that I'm an attorney, and this is important for one specific reason. I'm very evidentiary based. I was raised in a scientific culture. I'm of the same sort of like, rigorous scientific method view of anything that would, provide something that could be considered unusual. But I started discovering certain personality tests that, when interpreted properly, and that's the key, because many times they're not interpreted properly, and in conjunction with some give and take with the child, I can sort of uncover what I call their motivational blueprint. And I'm sure we'll get into this in a moment, but it's very clear to me that students are different and their motivational patterns are different. And one of the biggest problems biggest challenges I see that parents have is thinking that they're like them. That tends to be the thing. Like, my kid must be motivated by the same things I was motivated by at 16, and that's not always the case.
Certainly not the case with my kids. So give an example of that. Like, how does it, just in terms of giving guidance, how does a parent figure out, and you talk about it in the book, but many haven't read it, how does a parent figure out how to what kind of personality type there are, and what are the different types? Give us a sort of a broad overview of the different types out there, and how we as parents can kind of figure out, okay, what do I have on my hands here? I mean, we all have a sense of what kinds of things, who they are and what drives them. But when I go through your book, it's actually interesting, because sometimes I said, well, maybe I was wrong about one of my kids, and I see different attributes. It sort of spans a few of your categories, but it's just interesting.
So I'll start by saying, let's say with motivation, there's some aspects are generic. Let's say behaviorism, in other words, the carrot and stick phenomenon. That's sort of generic, and that works. But there are certain folks that might be more attracted to freedom, let's say. So that type I call the adventure boy. Now, I want to be clear that, most people, all things being equal, would take freedom over not having freedom. But an adventure boy, in terms of freedom, really just wants to do what they want to do. And they do not like being told what to do. And they tend to have a little bit of disciplinary issues. And my closest friend growing up was one of those. And he was, as they tend to be, high energy. So when they're directed properly, like he was in athletics, he was a great athlete. But when not directed properly, like in school where he's the class clown, it can be a problem. So in terms of understanding their type, first you have to understand what's their dominant driver. So let's say for that kid, if you can think of like a super high energy kid, freedom and fun is the biggest driver. Now there's another type of kid that I call the star boy. The star boy likes external success, which sounds like, oh, well, that kid should just be successful. In high school, being successful for a teen boy typically involves around popularity and maybe sports or some activity that they're in. It's not necessarily school. So in their case, what they're interested in is what other people are thinking. And they really care about that in a way that, let's say, the freedom and fun kid cares about a little bit, but maybe not as much as the star boy. So there's these subtle distinctions. Parents usually know their kids, and when I start to describe the various types, about 9 of which I think as the dominant paradigms, they're like, oh, my kid is more like that. And there's one more I'll just mention quickly, because they tend to be the one that causes all sorts of slow burning problems. It's what I call the go with the flow boy. The go with the flow boy, they're like really nice kids typically, but they don't have much intensity. And when I was actually going to start writing to motivate your son, my first title in mind was Raising Intensity, because the go with the flow boy, unlike the adventure boy, doesn't have a lot of energy. They don't like internal conflict. They just like to chill. So playing video games for hours is pretty much all they want to do. And the only reason to get them motivated, I suppose, really is kind of nagging them and putting in a structure that would work in a way that wouldn't work with freedom boys who don't like to be nagged. They need to be channeled, so to speak, or star boys who need to perform for an audience. So there's these different ways of looking at their motivational blueprint and then trying to press the right trigger.
It's interesting. It seems like for all the different types, there is a way to, or the goal is to connect them with to give them a vision of what their future is, and try to avoid and again, different personality types have different methodologies for this, but to give them a vision or a track into their future without being intimidating to them, right? I mean, so in each one is different. So if you're a boy who cares more about his perception, right? Then your language about college and a career has to do with perception as an entry point. And then from there they grow and mature, and they're going to change as they grow, but that becomes less, it's about lowering the barrier. I think for lots of our kids, in college is intimidating. I mean, the whole process of applying is intimidating, and the whole prospect of being in college can be intimidating with all the stresses and emphasis on where it is and name brand and all that stuff. So a lot of what you write about is lowering that threshold, kind of lowering the temperature, which is what we do a lot of in terms of our work that we do. But to speak to that a little bit in the sense that you're trying to connect to them, you want to get to where they are, so that they're not looking at you in any kind of adversarial way, or yet another voice in a sea of voices telling them what to do and how to do it. But you're trying to have them come to the conclusion, yes, this is what I want to do.
Right, exactly. So I'll give another type, the boss boy. And this is a type that most people would know quite immediately. As soon as I start describing them, they're like, yeah, that's my son, and this is going to be a problem. A boss boy would be, if you can picture what I say, like a middle linebacker, or if you can picture a good version, it would be like, if you remember the Gulf War, General Norman Schwarzkopf, or someone who's like a inspiring leader. But they're very anti-authority unless they respect the authority. If they respect the authority, they actually can fall in line quite quickly. Their focus is on control. So let's say the college discussion is often like, you better do your homework.
Right.
That doesn't lead them to feel control. What does make them feel control is when, let's say, if I met with them and I'm guiding them and I'm making clear that I'm not another authority figure in their life, and I'm sort of a help button for them. How do you want to control the situation? Don't you want to be able to control where you want to go to college? That starts to shift things, because I'll start saying, you don't want someone else to decide that you can't go where you want to go. So if we can control the situation, and I'll keep using certain words, it's not quite like, in some manipulative way. I just know that these are words that are attractive to certain types. So let's say control is highly attractive to boss boys. And then I'll start connecting that not only to college choice, but maybe to becoming an entrepreneur at an earlier age, because they would love to be running their own company. They don't want to work for, the man for the rest of their life, would be the way the typical conversation goes. So it's connecting that personality type to the immediate view of what would a college choice mean to them, to the later view of what they can see their vision of their work world.
That makes sense. Broadening it out, you talk a lot in the book, and we talk a lot in general about work character and what that term means and how important is that word. And it's been written about a lot, especially with boys and girls, about grit, and how you want to instill in our kids an ability to not just deal with adversity well, but also learn to develop skills, whether it be executive functioning or just there are lots of buzzwords out there, but learning how to work hard and effectively, basically, and building habits. So speak to that a little bit, because that's throughout your book about the goal of building a work character.
Absolutely. And so sometimes, of course, and it does seem that, I get a disproportionate number of kids who are striving for elite schools, which is fine. But it wouldn't be that we're trying to cultivate that necessarily. We're trying to help them towards their goal. And if that's their goal, that's fine. But that's not really what the mission is. The mission is to shift them so they can become great workers. And I'll tell a quick story on this front. Earlier this year, I worked with a young guy who's about as at least natively bright as I've ever met, but didn't really do his work. So his parents contacted me, and he was struggling. His grades weren't that great at all, despite his brilliance. And we just, for whatever reason, we clicked pretty well. And through a series of working together for several months, there were 3 areas, which I mentioned in the book as being critical, that suddenly he was making inroads on. And that's what his parents, who had been really focused on him getting into elite colleges, that's what they ended up being like. It doesn't even matter if he gets into an elite college, because you've changed him to become a harder worker. He has the ability to deal with the uncomfortable, which is actually really important. I think, in other words, my sense of this generation, I'm going to sound like an old crank here, but it does seem like the willingness to deal with the uncomfortable, which is like just sitting and studying for a long period of time, or sitting in class and not being bored, has decreased. And part of that is distractions in social media, which I'm sure everyone knows is part of the problem. The second area that I work on is what I call habits of excellence. And that's just getting, we really are, our destiny is in part formed by our habits. And if I can get kids to have good work habits, as in good work character, they end up long after we end our work together, they forever will have good work habits and character that will help them wherever they do. And the third area would be what I called deferring gratification. So there's the old Stanford marshmallow test, which I know is cliche and people probably are well aware of, but essentially the thought is if you're able to wait for the second marshmallow, so to speak, in other words, deal with some uncomfortableness and some delayed view as to like, I'll study another hour so I can get the A. Those are the kinds of kids that almost always end up doing well in life. They end up getting into a top college, et cetera. That's awesome. But regardless, we've shaped their character, and that's the real goal.
And that was the experiment where where the boy or the girl or the student was told, if you wait, you get yet another marshmallow. Isn't that how it went? You had it.
Yeah, so Stanford, I always say it's like, if there ever was a research experiment that had more impact, that the researchers were literally just studying this very small area of like related to sugar and different things related to marshmallows and kids and at a young age. And they put one marshmallow in front of kids. They did like, let's say 1,000 kids. And they would say, if you wait, let's say a minute, or I don't even they said at the time, until I come back, you'll get the second marshmallow. And obviously a lot of these kids, they're like 4 or 5 years old, they just grabbed the marshmallow immediately. And the ones that waited were unusual. And then here's where it got interesting. They weren't initially thinking it to be a longitudinal study, as in studying to see what happens when these kids got older, but they tracked these kids and they got better grades and they got better SAT scores and they had better, whatever, their outcomes throughout life were remarkable. And so learning to defer gratification ends up being this disproportionately important aspect of work character.
It's interesting in my experience, and maybe you can speak to this, we've all have, now and again have worked with athletes, and athletic kids tend to get that quicker than others, perhaps, in the sense that they know that they have to put forth, you reap what you sow, and what your benefits aren't always apparent when you're out first thing in the morning or having to get to whatever one is doing. And lots of athletes tend to get that a little easier than non-athletes, which can be interesting.
Yeah, I say this with anytime I'm working with a performer who's had success in any discipline. Athletics is easily the most obvious, but it could be in music as well. But it's something where like they were doing wind sprints at 8 in the morning, and they were connecting that to some type of lacrosse performance later in the year, and they get it. They actually understand that as a distinct concept. That makes that part of the discussion much easier.
Changing gears a little bit, how do parents balance being sort of a taskmaster and being there to push? And sometimes dads and moms, will divide and conquer, but there's a dual situation where you want to be there to support them and you want to be them to be a safe harbor for them, but you also want to, you want to try to push them as much as you can, and that can be that's a challenge. I have, I have at times been best friends with my kids, and many times I'm like a pariah. I mean, I'm not best friends with them, and I struggle with that as well. My kids are a little older now, but that's always sort of an ongoing challenge for parents, I think, generally.
There's what I call the tension of being the unconditional love giver, which the parent was for their first period of time in life, to the boss nag, which is what they tend to be as teens, at least from the perspective of the teen. So one thing I would say, and this is something where we all, certainly, I just like everyone else had to discover this on my own. I learned to pick my spots, and this is what I mean. If I am going to be efficient and just sort of bark at my child to do their homework, that gets tuned out after a while. If there is some Sunday afternoon where it's a little bit more leisurely and there's a time for a walk and a talk or just a conversation and an explanation, look, I'm trying to help you. I just want you to really understand this. And my role as your parent is to make sure that you stay on track. And this is what I've observed would be helpful. So having these conversations, and even sometimes directly saying this, I realize that you're going to think I'm your boss and nag, but I'm really just your guide and your helper, is what needs to be done. I'll also say this, like in your case, Steve, it's good that you're actually, you've occasionally been a pariah, because oddly enough, and this is might be surprising, but I think our generation was so inundated with TV after school specials and movies about the overbearing parent that I've actually observed the opposite. The negligent parent is far, far higher. And I'm using the word negligent not in some harsh way. I want to be clear.
Far higher in what sense when you say far?
Far higher than overbearing parents. In other words, more there, like let's say back in the day, there was that sort of that constant nag that parents would be. These days, it seems like, look, I want to be, I want, and I understand, I want my relationship with my child to be good, but sometimes it's gone a little bit too far where they're like, I'm just not going to talk about it at all. So suddenly, the parent is just sort of abdicated their role as the person who's going to be ensuring that the trains are running on time for the kid. And I've actually seen that with almost alarming frequency in the last few years. It's picked up, in fact, I think in the last 5 to 10 years, something generationally is turning, and I think that's part of it.
And then it kind of becomes a binary thing, because either our kids rally and they figured out, okay, if I'm going to be the one to drive this train, I got to figure it out, or they go off the tracks, one way or the other. So it becomes sort of a fork in the road a little bit.
That's right. It's literally a sink or swim. And unfortunately, of course, most teams don't have the internal, sense of what the consequences will be thereafter. Yeah. So, the likelihood that they'll sink is much higher.
Yeah. Daryl, talk about the role of chief education officer for parents. And generally, I like that term just because it encapsulates kind of what our role is as we're managing. And this is just boys, girls, all kids, basically. But boys in particular need sometimes guideposts and structure and someone to basically give them a sense of overall parameters in terms of their education. That could be in the summer, that could be during the school year. However, the importance of that is, and you've mentioned that in the book several times, how that's vital that we think of ourselves as the chief education officer.
So I'm going to give a metaphor related to healthcare. Now I hope no one listening, but of course it's highly expected that some people listening will have a child with a medical condition. When that is the case, I'm about to say the mom, it could be the dad, of course, but one of the parents will become the chief medical officer for the kid's healthcare. What I mean by that is they become expert in understanding the kid's chronic condition and how to make sure that the kid is treated well, and they guide the kid to do the things that the kid is supposed to do and all that stuff. Now, I would say when I was growing up, most people just turned over their kids' healthcare to the doctor and the healthcare system. And getting parents, they obviously they did what they were told to do by the doctor. But now it seems that a lot of parents are the chief medical officer, and the doctor is someone that they're retaining for specialist help and obviously following their guidance, but they're also intimately involved. Back in, again, my day, most people just sent their kids to school, and parents, other than kind of like, you better get good grades, and we know that occasionally, they weren't really that involved in guiding kids. And there was a reason for that in part. The consequences were not as challenging as they are now. I would say that, again, back in, graduating in the early 90s, most everybody, if they did reasonably well and went to a reasonably okay college, would get at least a reasonably good job. This is absolutely not the case anymore, pre-pandemic, by the way. So parents have to get involved. So how do they get involved? Well, first of all, of course, overseeing just the work character of the child and sort of ensuring that they're doing what they should be doing. But it goes beyond that. It actually goes into advising them as to what they might want to study when they're older. And that's just advising and guiding and providing information. It's not telling them what to do. So it's not being overbearing. It's just being much more involved in the guidance of their children. And I tell this to parents also because if they don't get involved, the number one influencer for their children will be their children's friends. Peers are unquestionably a huge influence. So I think it'd be better if the parents are more involved, certainly from the parents' perspective.
I think that's an interesting point. And you mentioned in the book as well about trying to finesse, and that's not the word you chose to use, but trying to be aware of who, especially for kids like you mentioned, star boys and social boys, the boys that care about perception. And the risk there is that who they're spending time with can be more impactful because that's their primary objective. That's their motivation, I guess, is how they're perceived. How do you, that's always tricky because if I told my kids, and you're not suggesting that you tell them who to spend time with, but perhaps there's subtler ways to impact them in a way. And I know you're not a therapist necessarily.
No, but
there is an intersection here between what we do and kind of trying to get them the best possible chance of success.
There's an in-between there. And of course, I want to be clear. I actually hung out with a fairly, social group of athletic guys who caused some trouble back in the day. And nothing was necessarily that bad about this as long as I was on track. So to the extent that there were distinct standards in my household, and of course, I didn't get into real trouble in any real way. And the parents' role is not necessarily to change like who they hang out with, but to be a dominant influencer. Because if they're not a dominant influencer, I don't mean the dominant influencer, but a dominant influencer, then the kids will be. And so what in relation to this, it relates to their college majors, it relates to schools they find interesting. So many kids will say, well, yeah, I talked to Johnny and Johnny thinks that, Johnny might be brilliant, who knows, but half the time they're just a 17-year-old kid who doesn't know all that much.
Yeah. what else do I have here? And you've sort of already answered this, but I was curious as I read the book, and I recognize certain personality types with my own kids, and I certainly recognize them with a lot of my students. It's amazing how we jump to those, kids that we work with when you read about certain things. Any particular person, I'm just my own curiosity, any particular personality types that you find particularly tricky or challenging? You mentioned go with the flow.
Yeah, I'll go with the dreamer boy though, because
Okay.
the dreamer boy. So if you can picture like a kid who's a bit unusual, it is a bit stereotypical, but it tends to be the folks who might be more interested in, let's say, theater or music. They're the type. They're known as the dreamer boy in my little parlance, but they're known as the tragic romantic is actually the name. Now the reason why they're challenging is that they have a mixture of both inferiority and superiority within their psychological makeup. Their inferiority is that they constantly feel misunderstood. So you can picture like a group of typical guys, and they don't feel like that. They actually feel like an outsider in that regard. So that's where their inferiority comes from. But they also have a level of superiority where they're like, these guys, they don't have my taste, or they don't have my specialness or uniqueness. So the challenge with them is to have them understand that their rejection of conventionality has to be sliced. Okay, so maybe they reject conventional popularity, for example, in high school, but that doesn't mean the whole thing goes out where they reject good grades and trying to get into a college that would serve them best, because some of them do that entirely, and they're pretty complex kids. So they're actually and they really feel that no one understands them. So it really takes some energy to break through and make sure that they get that their individuality.
Yeah. To what extent do you find for those kids that are just like, maybe college just isn't for me? They've had a tough time in high school. They haven't found their academic rhythm, and they're just like, perhaps, maybe it isn't right for them. And maybe that's the right answer. At what point it's not a concession necessarily. Maybe that is maybe a vocational school is the best spot for them.
So since I started this work, right, and so this, of course, it relates to in part to our clientele, which tends to be in the shoreline and Fairfield County in Connecticut. So the type of sort of affluent suburbs where my suggestions to consider the trades are usually not met. They're usually not embraced by either child or parent, but it's definitely my suggestion that some consider the trades. The same thing with the military, which is obviously even a trickier one, and I'm more careful suggesting that because obviously I won't want to put someone else's child in harm's way. But just conventionally, those are two options that I think a lot of people should consider. Nonetheless, let's assume that if if the people that normally come to the learning consultants are on this type of phone call, then most probably aren't seriously considering either. What they should consider, however, is a gap year. So prior to the pandemic, I urged people to consider a gap year, particularly boys, particularly sort of immature boys. And there is some data, and it's, if it's overstated, but, boys do mature a little bit later. And, the folks who tend to drop out freshman year are the boys who just kind of go nuts, and they party quite a bit and they don't do their homework, et cetera. And pretty much every bit of research on those who take gap years and go to college supports the fact that they do better in college thereafter. It makes the investment better. And if you find a way to make it interesting and worthwhile during that gap year, it also could just be, one of the experience of their life, because it's a resume-less year. So that's brilliant if you can find a way to channel and develop their interests in areas that aren't necessarily scholastic.
I love the gap year thought. It's been a weird year, and I wanted to ask you about this year in particular, for boys in particular. But girl, I don't want to be limited to boys, but it's been such a strange year all the way around. I love the whole gap year thing for kids that are not quite ready and not jumping into college, especially with the price tag of schools these days. Having them just thrown away and be very much in the back seat of their college experience doesn't make a lot of sense if they're not semi-engaged one way or the other. So taking some time off, I think, can make an enormous amount of sense for those kids. Although this year has been such a strange year because so many kids were looking to do that because of all our known challenges, and so many schools weren't as open to that as they typically would be. But beyond all of that, what challenges have you found with boys in particular this year? has it been harder on them in particular boys than girls, or is it just this has been a weird year all the way around? I find so many guys come here, and we've been trying to get to in-person meetings, just because I think, especially for boys and girls, but it's been more, you can do so much more when you're in person, but it's been hard. So speak to that a bit, if you
So,
would.
again, there's abundant research illustrating that girls are better in structure than boys. And there's research that there's a bell curve that's very interesting, showing agreeableness and disagreeableness, where girls are more agreeable and boys are less agreeable. So in that context, any kind of structure is problematic comparatively. But in a weird sort of Zoom structure where they're just sitting and staring at a screen all day, certainly worse, not in terms of discipline, of course, but certainly worse in terms of their actual learning. So now when we teach, for example, SATs, I always see people's gaps. And now I see it really, really clearly, and probably more with boys than girls when I think about it, because they're not really learning. What they've mastered is the check the box system that is part of the process of Zoom school. So they figure out how to do the assignment. I hate to say it, but a lot of them are cheating and all that kind of stuff. So they're not really learning that well. They're just getting it done. And if I had to guess, I mean, there's no data to make me say this with certainty, but I'm guessing the boys are not learning as much as the girls this year during this pandemic.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely true. Now I have a couple of questions here that I'm going to try to get through, and hope I'm not going to miss any. So let me just read them to you.
Sure.
This is from someone in West Palm Beach. I have 3 sons who are completely different boys. It is so hard to imagine, inspire, and keep on them. Can you please share favorite success story? That's a great question.
Yeah, well, that's a great one. So I'll say the one that I led the book with is probably one of my favorite ones, because as a kid, it was kind of out of control. He was just like a wild character, and he was one of those adventure boy, freedom, fun types, right? And we worked together to the point where I started to show him college as an escape. He viewed college as like like he just thought it was work. He didn't have any older siblings, so he didn't know that it was really fun and provides a lot of freedom. So his view of college was that it was just going to be like a lot more work, because that's how his parents had presented it to him. And when I, showed him that college can be a lot more work in some ways, but usually in areas that you care about, and then started pressing the freedom and fun buttons, he started channeling his energy. And then we just coincidentally happened to see a Navy SEAL documentary around the same time. And I mentioned, he's like, oh my God, I saw that was amazing. And we started talking about the intensity that the Navy SEALs have. And this kid had a lot of intensity. It was just going all over the place. And we just started channeling it towards his school. And here's where it got interesting. He understood that the Navy SEALs who were like sitting in the water at 4 a.m. were freezing. They didn't enjoy it. And he realized that part of the reason they were, becoming Navy SEALs is they were able to deal with the uncomfortable. He really got it. And he said, this is my Navy SEAL moment, isn't it? When we were talking about him just sitting down and doing work for 30 minutes straight. I said, yes, that's your Navy SEAL moment. So he ended up becoming, he went to a really good school, and he's in Boston now and thriving in business. So that's one of my favorite stories.
That's awesome. Anyone else from a different type of personality, just to give a different sort of a contrast with that?
Yeah,
I'll put you on the spot.
Star boys, and they're a little bit, at some level, sort of cliche, but let's say with a star boy, that they tend to be athletes. They tend to be fairly socially popular, because that's what they're striving in both cases for. And then having them understand that, like, okay, in 9th and 10th grade, I suppose part of the picture, academics aren't a big part of the picture. Having them understand that soon enough, people will think that doing well academically is also part of the success picture. And otherwise, they'll just be the stereotypical athlete who sort of, flames out after high school and,
Right.
no longer was a great success. So one of my, favorite kids also, this kid, Nick, where we just started talking about what he viewed as success later in life. And then he realized, like, oh yeah, I better do well in school. And like, fortunately, he was really bright. And it wasn't a matter of like, I barely tutored him after that. It was just like, okay, I need to do well in school now. And he just took off. And it was just like pressing a button that I happened to hit at the right time. Sometimes, of course, I get lucky. It's like, I just happen to be there, the coming of age moment. That's what I tell people. One of the things I love about our work is that we're catching them at a time they're starting to think for themselves. And if we can hit them correctly, we can inspire them. They just can change magically.
So I think it's a really great moment when we have that. That is so true. talk a little bit about we're talking a lot about colleges and kids in high school, but for those of, middle school, even elementary school kids, boys, the importance of getting on them early, not on them, but to try to impact them and affect them earlier, can be helpful. Although it's a different process when you're sitting with a fifth or sixth grader, or even younger, right? I mean, it's going to be a different set of, they're not going to necessarily be thinking of colleges, but one thing that you talk about in your book is it's important to connect them, even at an early age, to some future version of themselves, right? To make them aware of the track and not, get out of the moment necessarily. And even at the younger kids, you talk about that, which is interesting to me.
Yeah, so there's a dialogue that I use. I call it the older self dialogue, because of course, if it's a normal kid, they are sick of being talked at by their parents about you should do this, you should do this. So one of the ways I turn it on, I mean, they're obviously expecting me to say the same thing. I said, let's say I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to have you talk to your older self. So let's say with a 13-year-old, 12-year-old, something like that, and you just say, okay, well, what do you think you at 16 or 17 will start to want? They haven't thought about it. But here's where it gets interesting. People are pretty interested in their own lives, right? Even at that age. So a lot of parents, be like, that's kind of a weird question. And it might be from a parent's perspective, but from an outsider's perspective, it's not that unusual to interact with a kid in that way, because like you're just an outside force, and they know that you're there for some type of educational purposes. And when I start asking that question, particularly if they have older siblings, they almost always say, oh, I guess I'm going to want to have good grades, won't I? And then I'll say something like, and that a lot of things you're learning right now, like if you don't learn fractions down, if you don't learn decimals and percentages, you won't be that happy in high school math. And like not me and not your parents, you won't be that happy. And then they're like, oh yeah, you're right. I said, because I'll say it's building blocks. And so again, there's probably some age where this wouldn't be effective. And I certainly don't work with, let's say 8-year-olds or even 10-year-olds, but 8th grade boys are, within the range where they can get there.
Yeah, that's true. And I think goes back to your theme again. It's letting them make letting them make the realization that it matters for them, not for you, not for me, not for their parents, but they need to recognize that it matters for them. And when that happens, it's like a light goes on. And that does happen at all ages. I do work with some younger kids, and it does certainly happens for them at that age as well. A question here about special tips for boys with learning disabilities.
Yes. So let's say that there are some issues that are within the range of specialized focus. So let's say anxiety and depression, drug use or addiction issues, and learning disabilities. So it certainly depends on the type. Now I'm going to give you some great hope. Having worked with more than a few students who have learning disabilities, I'm thinking of dyslexia in particular, but certainly others as well, they develop work character more than folks who don't.
I would agree. I've seen that myself. Yeah.
So while it might be, if you're a parent, I really understand that it's a struggle, and it's kind of from a parent, a heartfelt pain to see them struggling with what you might consider an assignment that should take them 20 minutes. They're doing it in 45 minutes. The fact that they're doing it in 45 minutes and they actually do it, it ends up leading to greater success. So the very specific, like how do you deal with, again, I'll use a different issue. How do you deal with a kid who's anxious? That's a very specific type of methodology that obviously requires some interaction. And obviously the various learning differences that students have would require understanding which one it is. But I will simply give you the hope that, oddly enough, in my estimation, it ends up, if they put in the work, it ends up being something where they almost invariably wind up successful.
Got it. But the process is it's sort of the same process. It's just with the recognition that the work is it's the process, not the result necessarily. And if that process is intact and it's developed, that will benefit them, throughout their lives. Basically.
No, that's right.
And I've seen that as well.
And it also, I guess there's what I should have perhaps led with. The psychological process is no different for folks learning differences. It would simply be, and this is in broad strokes, it would just be like some kids great in math and someone's terrible in math, but the psychological typing and process of interacting with the student wouldn't change in any way.
Got it. What are good activities in books for motivating boys?
Well, books, if you're saying to read. So I'll get on one, like, I don't want to get on a high horse.
By the way, I'm reading questions, by the way. These aren't coming.
Yeah, I understand. So let's say with reading, I'm going to say, unfortunately, I totally get why you have to have some type of common curriculum. I understand that, okay? But as someone who loves to read, and knowing that there's thousands of amazing books to read. I'll say that the best thing that my dad did to me, and probably, not something that people do much more because people don't go to libraries, but he would take me to the library and let me read whatever I wanted. Okay, so I'd go there, and of course, when I was younger, I would guess that 9 out of 10 books dealt with sports. Okay, but it helped me cultivate a love of reading. So a long way of saying that if the question is about what kids should be reading, it certainly should be anything of their choice. Get them reading. Now, if it's a question about what parents should be reading about, what other books besides Motivate Your Son, there are plenty. There actually was one called Raising Cain, I think, that was considered sort of the classic, I think, if I recall. So that I actually haven't read it, but I heard it's quite good. And I certainly read a few, and I have to go back, and if someone wants to email me, I can go back through my list and give you some other books. But just go to Amazon. I'm sure Motivate Your Son would have the ones that people buy next to it, and those are probably pretty good ones.
And for those parents out there with young boys or young kids all the way around, I found that, and I read to my kids until they were much older than one would think would be allowable, basically, and in terms of what they wanted to do. But they loved having stories read to them. I think really helped them in terms of quieting them down, for one, but also giving them a love of reading, which hopefully carries throughout their lives. And it's amazing how they wanted to do that through to their teens. I mean, it was interesting to me in that sense. Interesting. So my son is highly motivated academically, but is socially awkward. How can we help him?
So that, I'd have to, meet him to understand the nature of his social awkwardness. But let's say that I'll give you again some hope that he's socially awkward in the particular atmosphere that he's currently in. Now, unfortunately, and I'm not sure if he's from one of the small towns that sort of, populate Connecticut, it might be a little bit tricky to shift dramatically anytime soon. I hope it can be, but it almost always happens through interest groups, often outside of the school. So they start getting like, it's where they're not carrying their baggage. So in other words, they're doing something, whatever they're interested in doing, and it doesn't have a lot of kids from your school. That's the simplest way. And then also, by the way, a hook, although your son probably is, the son in question probably doesn't need it, is I tell people college, you're really choosing your people, right? So that's another way of, getting them excited about the college process, is to sort of escape, the challenges of high school. And I sometimes say this, like I organize my high school reunions, and the reunion planner that I first hired, we had what I thought was a disastrous response. It was like 1/3 came back. And she was like, no, that's actually way better than the national average, which is like 24% or 28% at the 10th reunion. And she said, and I said, really? And she said, oh, you liked high school, didn't you? I said, I did. She goes, well, most people hate high school. Most people feel socially awkward and horrible. So my guess is some of the kids that you might view as confident are feeling similar. They just might put on a better facade than your son.
And I think it's a good opportunity to talk about the advantage and the good aspects of college, because you're right. I think it does become easier, not for everybody. Everybody's a bit different, but in many ways, yeah. I mean, you can choose your surroundings in a way that you can't in high school when you're in college. And I think for many kids that can be the thought of that can be appealing. And this is something we've talked about: gap year versus PG year, and we've touched on that a little bit, but not necessarily PG versus gap, because I've had this conversation with some of our clients and some of the kids that I work with on both sides of this spectrum.
Yeah, so obviously the reason why many athletes take PG years, in part because it's part of the athletic recruiting process. And so for those who don't know what a PG year is, they'll go to a private boarding school, typically, or it could be a private day school, in which they'll do another year of high school, it's obviously a type of gap year. Now, gap year, more traditionally speaking, is doing something outside of a school setting. So Europeans are, pretty common. They have their kids travel or do programs or some work, et cetera. So they are different. And in terms of the PG year, obviously there's an expense to it, unless the person's getting a scholarship for, playing at the school or something along those lines. So that would, be another large factor. And if someone can do it, expense is not the biggest factor. And if they need to bolster their academics, and of course, if it's related to athletic recruiting, a PG year is a wonderful option, and it might beat other ways of doing a gap year.
I mean, I think at PG year, most frequently it's the athletes that want to develop their skills. But for some kids that just want to have a sort of a half measure or a sort of a smaller step before they get to college, or want to develop their living away from home, perhaps a PG year can be interesting in terms of the non-athlete. It can be, but again, I guess it depends on what the objectives are and what you're trying to accomplish in that sense for a PG year. Can your son be a mixture of these? And when you see these, I think I think a mixture of your personality types. I definitely have seen mixtures in my own kids as well as kids that I have had as.
So let's say this. I'm going to say that, like, whatever way you understand your son, you don't necessarily need a personality test or anything else. So your understanding of the unique blueprint. If I got into personality theory and I described it in greater depth, I would simply say that there's usually a dominant driver, and they have what they call wings that are adjacent to someone. So if someone who's a star boy with a dominant social boy wing actually presents differently than someone who's a star boy with a dominant dreamer boy wing. And not to bore people with the methodology related to the Enneagram, which is the test I'm referring to. You can even think of Myers-Briggs in this regard. If someone is an extrovert, they'll rate them on a scale of 1% to 100%. So someone who's 100% extroverted is obviously off the walls and talking all the time. Someone who's anything below 10% might even come across as introverted. So a long way of saying that I fully recognize the complexity of people. You presumably understand your son better than anyone in the world. But when I meet with people, I almost always can tell what's the dominant type and what are the two other types that are influencing the person.
Talk about that. You mentioned the Enneagram in the book quite frequently, and the Myers-Briggs is another source. We use, youth science. There's lots of these personality assessments or questionnaires, really. I mean, I don't know how they all necessarily work, but talk about the importance of that and how that can be a tool to begin to get a sense and discern kind of, okay, what kind of personality do I have here on my hands? Sometimes we're surprised by the answers in these things.
So I'll start again with, I want to be very clear. I am someone who is a practical person. So, the tests themselves don't necessarily show something without expert interpretation. You have to understand that they're just starting points. They're not endpoints. So if someone gets, let's say, I'll use an example of the Myers-Briggs, which is just more well-known than the Enneagram. If they come out as an ESTJ, which is extroverted as in they're sort of outgoing, a sensate who is more attuned to their surroundings, a thinker, which is someone who's more head-based than heart-based, and a judger as in someone who's fairly structured, it gives me some sense as to what their preferences are, just as a starting point. But then I have to take a look at them personally and sort of mix and match the other influences of their life and understand how it relates to their work character and how it'll help them work. But they are good starting points. You'll be surprised. Some kids love them, and by the way, know what I think it really does? It gives an entree point to discuss their internal makeup. That's what I think it's actually best for.
Yeah, exactly. It does give it a forum to begin to talk about things, which can be awkward. It can be difficult to broach some of these things. But when you have something in front of you, you can talk about why it doesn't apply to them, right? Or whatever that it doesn't, that it's wrong or whatever. And that begins the process in a constructive way to talk about what their hopes and dreams and what they care about.
And just one more point on that, because what happens with we're all pretty good at facades, or at least many people are good at facades. And it's happened more than a few times that I've given a personality test and the kid just looked at me like, oh my goodness, you uncovered the real me. And I've been pretending. So with Myers-Briggs, if you ever look up the INFJ, it's definitely not someone who would fit into like an aggressive, male sports dominated culture. And I was working with a kid who was in that culture, and his dad was like that, and his older brothers were like that. And he had just put on a facade to be one of the boys. And he wasn't like that at all underneath. But if you met him at first glance, he kind of looked the part, and he had the way of speaking it. And then it was like, and so if the parent can get that, they're like, oh, I've been treating you one way. You've just been sort of putting that on. Let me really get to know the real you in a deeper way.
Do kids generally? I mean, I can't imagine if I hadn't done this with my boys, but if I suggested to them that they're going to sit down and do a personality test, they may look at me like I've got 7 heads. I mean, I don't know how.
So let's say this again, a totally gender-based view. when I work with girls and when I work with women in the career counseling, they love this stuff, just as again, a broad generalization. And guys would be like 50-50. Some guys are like, yeah, it's interesting, but they just tend to be more skeptical. And it's because it's less tangible, which boys tend to be more attracted to. They are more skeptical to it. Again, one of the big advantages, and Steve, you know this, we are the friendly uncle, right? So we come across this is going to be helpful. So they're more likely to do it when we suggest it than a parent. I recognize this. Right. But some of them find it kind of fun. They're like, oh, this is.
Most of the kids that I work with do find it. They resist it. There's always a gap. There's a lag between suggesting it and then them doing it. But when they actually do, almost all of them enjoy it because it's not rigorous. It's just a probing, discerning process which they enjoy generally. I mean, that's been my experience all the way around. But in terms of it, so Myers-Briggs, Enneagram, is there any other ones just in terms of just giving parents?
So those are like more personality profiling. There are others related to career. There's a strong Campbell, which relates to career, and there's other sort of career tests that are pretty good. So for younger, most 9th and 10th grade boys would have no real way of doing one of those because it would relate to like work aptitudes and stuff. So just as a personality profiling, those two are pretty good.
Okay. I'm a boss nag and hate being one. Any tips? And this is, that's hard. And that's what we talked about a little bit earlier.
Is that the question? I'm a boss, but hate being one?
I am such a boss nag.
Oh, the parents.
And hate being one. Any tips? In other words,
there is. I will say this, okay, and this is very tough, of course, but there is that, you choose your moments and choose your battles. So in terms of choosing battles, things that are of not, and you have to, make these judgments, not of significant consequence. I don't know if this is a parent. This is a parent is saying this, right?
I'm assuming.
Yeah. So it's a nag. Yeah, got it, being nag. Sorry. So
I don't think this is a student saying this. No.
Right. I was
think
thinking
it's no question that it's.
Right. I was thinking of the boss boy, but let's say so let's say that there's probably some areas where your control issues are not consequential, right? So letting those go a bit. And so whether it's certain levels of neatness that you require or something, and again, maybe that is important. I don't mean to put my own values onto it, but maybe let up a little bit on those and only sort of direct your energy on things that really matter. And then the second area is, I definitely get this one. The efficiency of barking at someone is, it gets things done more quickly in the moment, but obviously after a while, just, really hurts the relationship. So disciplining yourself not to do that. And then
not to do what? Not to bark at them.
Not to snap. You see something, you're like irritated and you better blah, blah, blah. And that just creates, that tension. Going, okay, it's going to be again on a Sunday afternoon. We're saying, listen, can we talk for a few minutes? And then being a little vulnerable, just like, listen, this is the reason why this upsets me is this. And, it's because I care about you and all that kind of stuff, which tends not to, it's a little bit odd, but that just comes across way better than just snapping.
Right. No, I think that's that is very true. Let me see if I'm missing any other questions. I think I may be missing some because I don't know that I'm doing this right. But I think I've covered all the bases on that. Daryl, anything that you wanted that I'm missing in terms of the general thrust of your book?
The only thing I would say is this, and this isn't this I think people understand, whether they understand it intuitively or they understand it just literally from understanding the trends in the world. It was not as problematic even 10 or 15 years ago. I think the Great Recession actually shifted things quite a bit, and obviously the pandemic has sped up the changes. We are literally in the most transformational economic times, perhaps in the history of humanity, which sounds hyperbolic, but it's not. Even the Industrial Revolution, it took over 75 years to sort of from start to finish. This is happening unbelievably. In other words, just look at this, where Zoom conversation as just one of 1,000 example. Now, the reason why this is so important is that I describe what I call 3 paths. I describe the path of abundance. So the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world and all those other, not just the entrepreneurs who are making, way more money than than anyone in the history of the world, but many, many, many top-notch, talented young people in their 20s and 30s can lead unbelievable lives that we never could have because we had to wait until we were 40 or 50 to get the benefits of our hard work. A lot of these young people, if they can create something or just be really talented in the work and they have the work character at 13 to 17, and they go to some place that can cultivate that talent, and then obviously get into the work world and the right fit, they can have amazing work lives, which is going to be amazing, right? Unfortunately, of course, there's a lot that are going to be what I call the path of struggle. So when we were growing up, of course, America was so dominant that, most anyone who graduated from a pretty good college would do fine. And it's maybe not the case as much as it once was, right? So a lot of people who are doing, the proverbial, B students might not be doing as well as they used to be. And then, of course, the real scare is that the path of struggle, there's never been a time since the Great Depression where there's going to be so many young adults, and I don't mean young like 22, I mean like 29 and 30 and 34, living at home because they can't be financially self-sufficient. Nothing wrong with living at home, by the way. I think it's actually not a bad thing, and it's actually probably a good thing for families to be much closer, of course. I'm just saying they're not going to be financially independent, and it really can be traced back to their teen years, not developing work character, not having great college choices, or not being able to handle college when they get there, and then floundering thereafter. So be mindful that we're not in normal times.
Yeah, that's so true, and I think it's an exciting time. There is such opportunity out there for kids. I mean, the barriers to entry for all sorts of things is lower than it was, and that's exciting. One thing that I've noticed that I've seen in kids that are at college and even at some high schools is the importance and the emphasis of collaborative work. I mean, there's that intersection between socialization and social activities and academic work. And I've seen it with my kids as well as many others that I work with, that intersection is becoming really important as they enter a career, right? Knowing how to network, knowing how to be comfortable working in groups, not just alone. When we all, I look at my parents or different generations in the past, a lot of it was independent work. Now with the advent of whether it be Zoom or different technologies that allow us to work in groups, it's changed a little bit of what the expectations are in education. And I think it's productive, but it also shows the importance of working collaboratively, basically. Right?
Yeah, and the hope, by the way, I mean, I've seen this with just wonderful community service projects, and obviously folks who are starting small businesses, and some of them might end up being, a real company at some point, working with their buddies. That's a tremendous way, like having them work. I have the two guys, I'm working with, really one guy, but I know the other guy now, starting an online newspaper together. It's fantastic. And this, young guy is interested in journalism as a career, and, what he's created so far looks astonishing. And once you start learning how to do that, that would be a good way to direct their energy. And that can be fun and interesting and direct their intensity as well.
Yeah.
Hi guys, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, great. I'm sorry. We're getting down to the 7:00 hour. I'm having some technical difficulties. Surprise, surprise. But this has been an amazing, amazing conversation. The last question was for me, and I'm gonna try to practice what you're telling me. If not, I've got you both on speed dial. But thank you, Daryl Capuano and Steve Stanton from the Learning Consultants Group. We are going to have this. We've recorded tonight's conversation, which is great, and we're going to send it out to everybody. And on behalf of Pequot Library, this has been amazing. And do you have one last line, Daryl? Any last words of wisdom for us?
Yeah, what I'll say is I really do mean this. Parents are the heroes of education. Obviously, teachers are in their own right, but it's almost always when I have a success story, it's the parent who is the hero. And the reason why it's the hero is they really have to battle through a lot. They have to battle through distractions that are, tenfold more than what we had when we were younger. They have to battle through grumbling and mumbling and dealing with, their kids hating them temporarily and all that kind of stuff. So it really takes a lot of energy. Anyone on this call or anyone who's taking the battle to heart and willing to deal with all the challenges of being a good parent, I salute you.
Well, thank you, Daryl, and thank you, Steve. And again, the learningconsultantsgroup.com. You can check these guys out. And we'll see you all hopefully in person at Pequot Library before too long. Daryl, we'd love to have you in person.
I would love to
We'll drag them down.
Thank you. I'd love it.
Thanks. Have a great evening. Thank you so much.
Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.